Hey guys, it's Chloe. Welcome back, or welcome to my channel. A couple of weeks ago, I did an off-road trip where I went all around Arizona in my Toyota Tacoma TRD Off-Road, which I've had for 2 years now, and someone in the group had a TRD Sport. And there was a lot of conversation on that trip about the Sport versus the off-road trim. That got me thinking a lot back to 2019 when I purchased this TRD Off-Road, because at the time, I was super conflicted between buying the TRD Off-Road trim and the TRD Sport trim. So in today's video, I just want to give you guys my personal thoughts about back then, why I picked the TRD Off-Road, and kind of my perspective now of having the truck for over 2 years. I'm also going to talk about some of the things that I don't necessarily like in the TRD Off-Road trim that I do like in the TRD Sport trim for these 3rd gen Tacomas, and just overall why I think the off-road trim was better for me. Now, I do want to make it clear that I don't think that the off-road trim is better than the sport trim or vice versa, because they are just different and they both provide different features, and obviously everyone out there is going to have their own wants and needs for a truck, so one trim might not be the best for everyone. As I'm making this video right now, the truck market is really hot. I know a lot of people are buying and selling trucks, especially the 3rd gen Tacoma, and a bunch of you guys have messaged me or commented on my videos about the differences between the sport and the off-road, so I really hope this video helps you out. So first off, after a year of making weekly Tacoma videos, I found that people get Tacomas for a lot of different reasons. For some people, it's just the reliability, or maybe it's the towing capacity. Maybe it's the off-road capability, maybe it's the haul, or maybe it's just because it is a great looking truck. My personal reasons were to have a reliable daily driver that was also capable off-road, although I am aware that people will get these Tacomas for a variety of other reasons. Now, the whole reason I'm prefacing this video with this is because mostly in this video, I'm just going to be talking about the on-road and off-road capabilities between the two trims. I honestly don't tow stuff. I don't really haul stuff unless I need to, or unless it's my off-road recovery gear, which honestly isn't that heavy. So I just don't want to speak on those two perspectives. So if you're following this video and your wants and needs don't really align with mine, you can take this with a grain of salt. But let's just get right into the biggest reason I went with the off-road trim over the sport trim. So I didn't really know it at the time, but the rear locker is just something I am so thankful to have, because I use it more often than I even thought I would. So as of right now, for the 3rd gen Tacomas, I believe the only trims that you can get the rear locking differential with are the TRD Off-Road and the TRD Pro. So that feature is not included if you get the TRD Sport. Now, this isn't a feature I ever use on-road, because as far as I'm aware, you can only engage the rear locking diff when you're in 4 low. So it's a feature I only use off-road, and it's also a feature I only selectively use depending on the section I'm on the trail I'm on. So forgetting about on-road performance here for a minute and strictly talking about Tacoma's performance off-road, I'm sure a lot of you off-road veterans know about the importance of a locker and the usefulness of it. There have been multiple times where I'm on a section, particularly an incline with a lot of holes, and it's really difficult to get through when both of your rear wheels are getting different amounts of power. In cases where I have one of my Tacoma's rear wheels off the ground, which is kind of common in sections I just described, the rear locker gives you the same torque to both of those wheels, so the wheel on the ground can actually rotate with the wheel off the ground. So all I'm stating is pretty much the obvious, that a rear locker can help you get through more sections than if you didn't have a rear locker. So that's the biggest feature I really love about the off-road that isn't offered in the sport. And again, it was kind of something I didn't realize at the time, which now thinking about it, obviously the rear locker is going to be useful if you're doing stuff like that. Another thing about having a rear locker is it allows me to tread lightly on the trails and not eat up the trails. This is just something really important to me. I don't want to ruin the trails I'm going on for other people. So overall, because I like taking my truck on some of these sections, oftentimes with a lot of holes, the rear locker makes the TRD Off-Road a little bit worth more than the TRD Sport trim for me, but again, it's pretty situational when I actually use it. Another big difference between the off-road and the sport is the exterior styling, because they both look different and unique in their own ways. I'd say first and foremost, you can tell a sport versus an off-road if you check out the hood, because there's a hood scoop on the sport and there isn't a hood scoop on the off-road. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I am a big hood scoop fan. I think it looks amazing on the Tacoma. It complements its styling really, really well, even though it's non-functional, and it just gives the truck a more aggressive look. But I will say that from the interior, when you're actually driving the truck, the scoop is definitely visible. It doesn't block your visibility or anything, but it is slightly raised from the inside, and you can definitely tell that it's there when you're driving. So the hood scoop's one big thing, but another big thing that you get on the Sport that you don't get on the TRD Off-Road is color match fender flares. My TRD Off-Road has unfinished and unpainted fender flares, and the reason they did that was not only for styling, but because scratches don't easily show up on the unfinished flares. I can definitely attest to that. Personally, for me, having unfinished fender flares is better because my fender flares have been scratched up multiple times on multiple trails. But again, I'm personally someone here that likes the sport look over the off-road unfinished look. The color match fender flares look great. I was thinking about getting them color matched on my own off-road just because I liked it so much, but because of all the scratches I get on the trails, I just don't think it'll be worth it for me. Another thing I don't really hear about fender flares is how chewed up the rear ones get. I do have aftermarket all-terrain tires, although they're not too different from the stock tire size, but they kick up a lot of stuff, not just on the trails, but on road. You can totally see all the dents and chips on the truck, even from far away. It does not look great, and it would look 10 times worse if I had color matched fender flares. So I guess it's good that I have the unmatched fender flares, but in an ideal world, I'd love to have the color matched ones. Obviously, this has all been my opinion because styling is something that's really, really subjective, but I would say the sport styling, in my opinion, is a little bit more refined, and I'm edged more towards how the sport looks. Like I said before, one of the big reasons I use my Tacoma is to daily drive to work. So ride quality was really, really important to me when I was choosing between the off-road and the sport. And let me tell you, there is a difference. There's a couple of different things that attribute to ride quality between the two trims. One of those things being the tires. The stock tires you get on the TRD Off-Road are not only a different tire, but also a different tire size than the TRD Sport. But another different thing that you get on the Off-Road and the Sport are different shocks. Now, what I'm about to say is strictly from my own experience between driving an off-road and driving a sport. To truly understand the differences and the feel you get in terms of ride quality on both of these trims, I suggest you go to a local dealership and test drive the off-road, then test drive the sport. I'm gonna do my best to describe that feeling, but it's going to be from my own perspective. So the TRD Sport stock comes with these shocks that are considered to be sport tuned. I'm not really sure what that means, but based on test driving it 2 years ago when I was buying my own Tacoma, and then a couple weeks ago test driving it again on road on my Arizona trip, the stock shocks on the TRD Sport are pretty rough on road. Personally, I could just feel a lot of the bumps and the potholes in the road a lot more than in the TRD Off-Road. But with that slightly stiffer ride quality, I also could feel that the Sport handled a little bit better than the TRD Off-Road. The stock shocks on the TRD Off-Road are made by Bilstein, and they're considered to be TRD tuned. And based on my own on-road driving experience, I just find that these shocks are a little bit softer. Don't get me wrong, you can still feel some of those bumps in the road with the TRD Off-Road shocks, but overall, in my opinion, it's a much less rough ride than the TRD Sport on road. Now, in terms of off-road performance, I honestly haven't gone off-roading with the Sport that much. It was really my first time getting behind the wheel myself and driving a Sport on my Arizona trip a couple weeks ago. And all I really did with that truck while I was driving it was go on a couple washboard roads and go on a pretty easy desert trail where there was a tiny bit of rock crawling, but not much. I was kind of unsure what to expect with the Sport off-road, given that it had a slightly more harsh ride quality on road, but I was pleasantly surprised. In the desert while driving fast, it handled really well like it does on road, and the ride quality is a little bit rough, but when you're going slow, you don't necessarily feel that. That's more about your tires. Now, the Bilstein shocks that are on the TRD Off-Road, I find are decently capable. I've taken mine on all sorts of different off-road terrains, and they do a pretty good job dampening, but I think I would expect a little bit more of a difference between the off-road and the sport in terms of the shocks. There's a difference off-road, and again, it's kind of hard for me to say because I didn't really get to off-road with the sport that much, and I didn't really get to take it on too many different terrains. But my initial impression is that with these shocks, the main difference you get is really on-road ride quality. Now, with all that being said, if you're choosing between an off-road and a sport and you want to keep the suspension stock, I guess this is all good information to know, but I ended up just getting aftermarket suspension, so for my case, the trim level wouldn't really matter in the end. By the way, if you have a 3rd gen Tacoma and you're looking to upgrade your suspension, I do have a couple videos of me installing both the front and the rear shocks. You can check those out here on my channel if you're deciding to do a DIY install in your garage. Now, I kind of hate to admit it, but at the time I was buying my Tacoma, and not now knowing what I know, what ultimately sold me on the off-road was the extra features that you get that you don't get on the sport, such as crawl control and multi-terrain select. And the reason I say I kind of hate that was because ultimately crawl control, that specific feature, is what sold me on the off-road. Thinking back, I'm not too upset with myself really because I never off-roaded in a 3rd gen Tacoma before, so I really wouldn't know too much about the crawl control feature, and I kind of had to take the dealership's word for it. But now, 2 years later of basically off-roading my Tacoma every other weekend, I rarely find myself using crawl control or multi-terrain select for that matter. Crawl control definitely works. I've gotten my truck stuck in the sand dunes and I've used it to get out before, but the caveat is that crawl control takes a really long time. I'm not hitting on it or anything, but it took a solid like 7 minutes for my truck to get out of the sand. I don't know if that was just in that situation, but that's just what I experienced. And overall, I wasn't really that stuck. I feel like it would have been faster to just get my shovel and traction boards out and then just drive myself out of the sand. It probably would have took less or the same amount of time, but that's just my own opinion. It's definitely a cool feature, but not something I find myself really using. I also tried to make sure that on this Arizona trip, I used multi-terrain select more than I normally did because I really wanted to test it out, because in the 2 years of having this Tacoma, I haven't really used it. So I set it to the specific terrain I was on, and you can definitely feel the truck drives a little bit different than if you're not on multi-terrain select, but like crawl control, it's not something I really end up using. But kind of going back to what I was talking about before, there are a couple of off-road features that aren't on the sport that I really like and find useful, like the rear locker and also the roll and pitch angle indicators. I think that is really useful, and I always have that menu selected when I'm going off-road. So I would say if you're thinking about buying the off-road just because it has the crawl control and multi-terrain select, maybe look into it a little bit more and see if you would find it useful. So overall, 2 years ago, what sold me on getting a TRD Off-Road versus the TRD Sport was the more features you get with the TRD Off-Road. There are times I really wish my truck looked more like the Sport, but I guess there are mods I can do to change that. But overall, if you're seriously thinking about going with the off-road or the sport and kind of what you envision using your truck for aligns with how I use my truck for, I would say the TRD Off-Road is a little bit more worth it. However, I always think back and wonder, what if I got a sport? And truly, I don't think a sport would really hinder me from doing anything I do today with my TRD Off-Road. I'd probably be equally happy with a sport, but I truly do love that rear locker, if you can't tell already. Anyways, I want to know your guys' thoughts on each trim, or if you have either of these trims and why you have them. If you guys are new here and like videos like this, I do make weekly videos about Tacoma mods and off-road content, so feel free to subscribe if you want. I also have an Instagram where I post more content. It is at ChloeKuoTaco. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.